Some secrets are better left unspoken, Margaret whispered to herself as she adjusted the delicate lace curtains in the sunlit living room, the morning light glinting off the polished oak floors, casting long shadows that seemed to echo the quiet tension in the house. Today was not just any day, it was the day she would watch her carefully constructed plan unfold, a plan that had been years in the making, hidden behind the veneer of normalcy she maintained for her family, and yet, nothing about this morning felt ordinary, not the soft hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen, not the smell of freshly brewed coffee that usually brought comfort, not even the way Emily moved through the space with that subtle edge in her step, a confidence that made Margaret's skin tingle with awareness. Because she had learned to read the smallest signs of ambition, of greed, and of hidden intentions, and Emily was radiating all three, Margaret's eyes followed her daughter-in-law as she rearranged the fruit bowl. A simple act that belied the storm of calculations brewing beneath. She smiled faintly, a private smile of someone who had learned that patience and silence often spoke louder than confrontation, and she sipped her coffee, savoring the quiet before the inevitable ripple of events. Because she knew that the house itself would soon become a stage, each room a silent witness to the subtle battle of wills that was about to unfold, and yet, she remained composed, letting Emily believe she was unobserved, letting her think the chessboard was tilted in her favor, unaware that Margaret already held the key moves in her mind. A ledger tucked away in a drawer, carefully updated with meticulous records of every transaction, every conversation that hinted at a plan to claim more than what was hers to claim. And as the clock ticked closer to the moment of revelation, Margaret's mind wandered briefly to her husband, to the life they had built together, to the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she could protect what he had entrusted to her while still maintaining the semblance of harmony, because in this house, appearances were everything, and Margaret had perfected the art of balancing truth with pretense. She rose from her chair, moving slowly, deliberately, her movements precise, each step measured, a dance of control and awareness, and she glanced at the family photos on the wall, images of smiles frozen in time. A stark contrast to the undercurrent of tension that now pulsed through the air, and she thought about how Emily had arrived with intentions masked behind politeness and charm, how she had ingratiated herself into the family, how easily people were deceived by the outward displays of warmth, and Margaret knew that this morning would mark the beginning of her quiet assertion, her subtle reclaiming of power, not through confrontation or shouting, but through strategy, through the careful orchestration of events that would unfold over the hours ahead. As Emily moved to pour herself a cup of tea, Margaret's hand brushed against the smooth edge of the counter, a grounding gesture, a reminder of her presence, her influence, and her knowledge that every detail, no matter how small, had been accounted for. And the soft ring of the doorbell broke the rhythm of thought, signaling the arrival of the first guest, someone unaware of the unfolding drama, and Margaret allowed a faint laugh to escape, delicate yet knowing, as if sharing a secret with the walls themselves, because she understood that in the quiet, in the patience, in the observation, lay her strength, and she would wield it with precision, watching Emily's face for the tiniest flicker of doubt, a hint that her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. And as footsteps echoed in the hallway, as greetings were exchanged with cheerful voices that barely masked curiosity and underlying tension, Margaret's eyes met Emily's across the room, a glance that held volumes, unspoken words, warnings, and subtle assertions of control. And she thought about how the hours ahead would test her resolve, how the simple act of sharing a meal, of discussing trivial matters, would be imbued with hidden currents, with strategies and counter-strategies, and she felt a rush of satisfaction, because for once, the house was hers, not through dominance or force, but through wisdom, through foresight, through understanding the psychology of those who underestimated her. And as she adjusted a folded napkin on the dining table, preparing for the arrival of family members who would unknowingly play their parts in the drama, Margaret allowed herself a small, triumphant smile, because she knew that every move she made, every subtle gesture, would contribute to the unfolding story, a story where patience, silence, and intelligence held more power than any overt confrontation. And as she heard Emily mutter under her breath about schedules and tasks, unaware of the watchful eyes upon her, Margaret leaned back, savoring the calm before the tide, a tide she would direct with skill, a tide that would reveal truths, unmask intentions, and leave a lasting impression. And she thought to herself that when the final moment came, when the subtle maneuvers reached their peak, she would not only have preserved what was rightfully hers but also imparted lessons about observation, caution, and the quiet strength of a woman who had learned to navigate the complexities of family, ambition, and betrayal. And with that thought, Margaret straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and let the day begin, a day full of promise, tension, and the unfolding of a story that only she fully understood. Margaret moved through the house with a deliberate calm, observing every detail, every gesture, and every subtle expression that might reveal the intentions lurking beneath the surface. She noted the way Emily paused slightly before picking up a glass, the faint hesitation betraying thoughtfulness or perhaps calculation, and Margaret allowed herself a small, knowing smile because she understood that true power lay not in overt confrontation but in careful observation and measured responses. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows highlighted the dust motes dancing in the air, creating a serene backdrop that contrasted sharply with the undercurrent of tension threading through the household. And as she arranged a set of fresh flowers on the dining table, their petals soft and vibrant, she reflected on the patterns of behavior she had studied over the years, recognizing the familiar signs of ambition, impatience, and subtle manipulation, and she felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing she had anticipated these moves, having thought through each possible scenario with meticulous attention, considering every eventuality and the consequences of each potential action, and yet she maintained a demeanor of tranquility, sipping her tea slowly, savoring the warmth and aroma, as if she were merely enjoying a peaceful morning, when in truth, her mind was calculating and strategizing, a complex dance of foresight and patience, and Emily, unaware of the depth of Margaret's awareness, busied herself with setting out utensils and checking the schedule for the day, moving with a practiced efficiency that masked both confidence and a hint of anxiety. And Margaret watched closely, noting every micro-expression, every subtle shift in posture, every glance that might hint at plans she had not yet articulated aloud. And she allowed herself to feel a quiet pride in the skill of her own attentiveness, the way she could perceive the hidden currents beneath ordinary gestures, the patterns of thought and intent, and she felt that the day held potential for revelation, for the subtle assertion of influence, for the careful orchestration of events that would unfold naturally as she guided the interactions with gentle precision. And as the clock ticked steadily forward, Margaret made her way to the family room, glancing at the photographs lining the mantel, images of family gatherings, vacations, and milestones, each one a reminder of the years of care and involvement she had invested, of the dedication and attention she had paid to nurturing relationships and maintaining harmony. And yet, she knew that beneath the veneer of familial affection, there existed motivations that were not always aligned with goodwill, and she observed Emily speaking with a cousin, offering smiles and nods, yet Margaret could see through the facade, discerning subtle gestures and choices that revealed intentions of personal gain, ambitions quietly nurtured, and Margaret found herself reflecting on the delicate balance of trust and vigilance, the understanding that to maintain both dignity and control, she must navigate with care, using observation, strategy, and timing rather than confrontation. And she allowed herself a moment to appreciate the quiet strength she had cultivated over decades, the capacity to read situations, to anticipate moves, to understand the unspoken language of gestures and glances, and she felt a sense of satisfaction in the knowledge that her calm presence and deliberate attention could shape the unfolding events without overt interference. And as she prepared refreshments for the family, arranging fruit and tea with meticulous care, she continued to analyze, to anticipate, to measure, to consider the possible reactions and counter-reactions that might emerge in response to each interaction, each question, each passing remark. And she noted the way Emily adjusted her clothing, the subtle fidgeting of hands, the slight tension in her posture, indicators that all were not as smooth as the outward appearance suggested. And Margaret felt a quiet reassurance, knowing that she was fully prepared, that she had anticipated these dynamics, and that through patience, clarity, and careful attention to detail, she could guide the morning, the interactions, and the subtle negotiations to a conclusion that preserved integrity and fairness. And as the doorbell rang once more, signaling the arrival of another guest, Margaret allowed a soft exhale, a subtle release of tension, and a poised smile as she moved to greet the newcomer, maintaining the appearance of calm hospitality while internally tracking, evaluating, and planning, because she understood that in this house, in these moments, power was quiet, strength was composed, and awareness was everything. And as she welcomed the guest, observing the exchange of pleasantries, noting every glance and gesture, she felt a sense of control and preparedness, ready to navigate the conversations, the subtle suggestions, and the quiet ambitions that would inevitably surface, all while maintaining a composed exterior, a nurturing demeanor, and an attentive presence. And she knew that the morning was just the beginning, that every detail mattered, that the smallest observation could provide insight, that careful listening and watchful eyes could uncover intentions, motivations, and designs that were otherwise hidden. And with that knowledge, Margaret continued her day, confident in her ability to manage, to guide, to observe, and to influence, fully aware of the subtle complexities, the nuances of behavior, the delicate interplay of relationships, and the quiet power that came from patience, attention, and wisdom. Margaret stepped quietly into the sun-drenched kitchen, the air filled with the subtle aroma of fresh bread and brewed coffee, observing Emily as she moved about with meticulous attention to detail, arranging plates and checking the silverware with a precision that spoke of both preparation and a desire to impress. And Margaret allowed herself a small smile, knowing that beneath the polished exterior there were currents of uncertainty, slight hesitations in her posture, a flicker of doubt in her eyes, all details she noted with careful precision, because she understood that the smallest gestures often revealed the greatest truths. And as she poured herself a cup of tea, steam curling gently into the morning air, she considered the subtle layers of interaction that would shape the day. The quiet power of observation that allowed her to understand intentions without confrontation. And she moved to the living room where family photographs adorned the walls, each frame a silent witness to years of shared memories, celebrations, and milestones. Yet Margaret knew that appearances could be deceiving, that behind every smile and polite word there might lie ambitions and designs hidden from view, and she allowed herself to appreciate the calm before the subtle currents of influence began to weave through the room, observing Emily speaking with a cousin, the tilt of her head, the measured inflection of her voice, the way she paused as if weighing each word carefully. And Margaret understood that these small choices, unnoticed by others, revealed the undercurrent of strategy and aspiration. And she felt a quiet reassurance in her ability to perceive and anticipate, the knowledge that she had planned carefully, that she had accounted for potential outcomes, that patience and attentiveness were her greatest allies. And as she adjusted a cushion on the sofa, she reflected on the lessons learned over decades, the understanding of human behavior, the recognition of patterns, and the cultivation of a presence that inspired both trust and caution in those around her. And Margaret moved toward the dining room, noticing how the sunlight highlighted the polished surface of the table, the gleam of the silverware, the vibrant hues of the fresh flowers she had arranged. And she appreciated the way these small details contributed to an atmosphere of warmth and welcome, while simultaneously allowing her to maintain control and awareness. Because she knew that true influence often operated quietly, subtly, without fanfare or overt assertion. And as she set down the teapot, she observed Emily retrieving a tray from the counter, the careful placement of each item revealing a mix of pride and tension. And Margaret recognized the interplay of intent and presentation, the subtle dance of impression and perception, and she considered how each interaction, each choice of gesture, could shift the balance of understanding in the room. And she continued to move with deliberate grace, greeting arriving family members with a composed warmth that masked the constant analysis occurring beneath, noting how questions were posed, how glances were exchanged, the measured cadence of conversation. And she understood that each moment offered information, that each detail contributed to the unfolding picture, and she allowed herself to take satisfaction in the awareness that she was prepared, that she could navigate the subtle complexities of human interaction, that her observations, paired with patience and discernment, allowed her to guide the morning in a manner both natural and controlled. And as the conversation flowed, Margaret listened intently, reading between lines, noting the inflection of voices, the slight adjustments in seating, the way individuals oriented themselves in relation to one another, and she recognized the unspoken communications, the hidden intentions, the subtle signals that would otherwise go unnoticed. And she felt a sense of quiet confidence, understanding that her ability to interpret these cues, to anticipate responses, to manage perceptions, was a skill honed over years of attentiveness. and she continued to move seamlessly through the interactions, offering polite remarks, measured smiles, gestures of warmth and care, all while internally tracking, analyzing, and guiding the subtle dynamics at play. And as the morning advanced, Margaret noticed how Emily attempted to influence conversations, subtly steering topics, inserting opinions, presenting suggestions with an air of authority, and she observed, unflustered, noting how others responded, how tensions subtly shifted in response to these moves, and she allowed herself the quiet pleasure of knowing that while Emily was focused on control, Margaret already held a comprehensive understanding of the landscape, the relationships, and the motivations, and she felt an inner calm, a steady assurance. Knowing that with careful observation, measured engagement, and the deliberate orchestration of moments, she could navigate, influence, and maintain both harmony and authority, and she continued to serve tea, adjust seating, offer gentle encouragement, and engage in conversation with thoughtful attention, weaving a pattern of influence and presence that subtly guided the day, all while maintaining the appearance of serene composure. And Margaret understood that every gesture, every observation, every carefully timed remark contributed to a quiet mastery of the morning, and she allowed herself to appreciate the subtle artistry of managing interactions, relationships, and intentions with insight, patience, and the calm authority she had cultivated over a lifetime. Margaret settled into the sunlit sitting room, the soft hum of the air conditioning blending with the distant sounds of morning traffic outside, her eyes tracing the familiar contours of the furniture, the worn edges of the armchairs, the gleam of the polished coffee table, and she noticed how each piece seemed to anchor the room in both memory and presence, a subtle reminder of the life carefully built over decades. And as she sipped her warm tea, she observed Emily moving between rooms with practiced ease, arranging the remaining breakfast items with a meticulous attention that spoke of both diligence and an underlying desire to impress. And Margaret could not help but note the slight pauses, the measured steps, the careful placement of each object, and she understood that these small actions, seemingly innocuous, were revealing more than Emily intended, insights into character, intent, and ambition, and Margaret allowed herself a soft smile, a quiet acknowledgement of the skill it took to perceive and interpret these cues, because she had honed this ability over years of observation, experience, and attentiveness, recognizing the subtle signals that indicated thought processes and emotional undercurrents, and she reflected on the dynamics of family life, how appearances of calm and civility often masked complex negotiations of power, influence, and unspoken intentions, and she felt a quiet pride in her capacity to navigate these complexities with poise and understanding, while maintaining the appearance of relaxed composure, as she moved to place a small decorative bowl on the side table, aligning it carefully with the edge of the sofa. She continued to monitor the interactions around her, noting the angles of gazes, the inflections in voices, the pacing of movements, each detail contributing to a larger picture of the household dynamics, and she considered how her role, subtle but significant, was to guide, observe, and influence, not through overt commands, but through presence, attentiveness, and the occasional carefully timed remark, and she noticed how Emily conversed with her son, Michael, the slight hesitations in phrasing, the careful selection of words, the nuanced inflections that indicated intention, persuasion, and an effort to assert influence, and Margaret understood that these interactions were both delicate and revealing, and she took mental notes, quietly cataloging observations, preparing for moments when intervention, suggestion, or guidance might be required, and as she placed her teacup down on the coaster, she allowed herself a moment to appreciate the sunlight streaming through the windows, the warmth on her skin, the sense of stability and awareness that came from being fully present, and she recognized that every exchange, every gesture, every glance could provide insight into the unfolding intentions, desires, and plans of those around her, and she maintained her serene exterior while internally cataloging, analyzing, and preparing for potential developments, and she observed how Emily carefully adjusted a napkin, the subtle shift indicating both attention to detail and an awareness of observation, and Margaret noted these signals, understanding their significance in the broader context of household dynamics. And she thought about the way family members would respond to varying degrees of suggestion, influence, and subtle guidance, and she felt a sense of quiet empowerment, knowing that through awareness, patience, and insight, she could shape interactions, guide outcomes, and maintain the dignity, harmony, and integrity of the home, and she moved gracefully to straighten a picture frame, aligning it with precision, all while listening intently to the conversations around her, noting changes in tone, inflection, and body language, and she understood that even a small detail, a fleeting expression, could provide critical insight into the intentions of others, and she felt satisfaction in the knowledge that her patience, attentiveness, and thoughtful observation allowed her to navigate these interactions skillfully, subtly directing the flow of events without overt interference. And as she poured herself another cup of tea, she reflected on the quiet power of presence, the importance of perception, and the skill of guiding family dynamics with insight, care, and measured influence, and she felt confident that the morning, while seemingly ordinary, held many opportunities to observe, understand, and subtly shape outcomes, allowing her to protect interests, maintain harmony, and quietly assert a presence that ensured her guidance and wisdom were recognized, appreciated, and respected, and Margaret continued her day with calm awareness, graceful movement, and focused attention, knowing that each small gesture, each observation, and each thoughtful interaction contributed to a deeper understanding of the family, its relationships, and the underlying motivations that would unfold throughout the day. Margaret moved gracefully through the sunlit hallway, her steps quiet on the polished hardwood floor, her mind fully engaged in the subtle orchestration of the morning's events. She observed Emily carefully placing a stack of napkins on the sideboard, her movements precise yet revealing a faint tension that Margaret immediately recognized, a sign of underlying anxiety or perhaps overconfidence masked by meticulous care, and she allowed herself a brief, private smile, a recognition of the skill it took to perceive these small but telling details, because she knew that the key to understanding and guiding the unfolding family interactions lay in the careful observation of such nuanced gestures. And as she reached the living room, Margaret noted the way sunlight highlighted the patterns of the rug, the gleam of the polished surfaces, and the subtle reflections in the windows, all forming a backdrop of calm and familiarity that contrasted with the complex web of unspoken intentions she was navigating. And she moved to straighten a chair, aligning it perfectly with the table, a simple act of order that reinforced her presence and quiet authority. And as she did so, she reflected on the interactions of the past hour, noting the slight inflections in Emily's voice, the pacing of her movements, the subtle ways she engaged with other family members, all indicators of strategy, ambition, and social maneuvering. And Margaret considered how she could gently influence these dynamics without drawing attention to herself, using calm composure, attentiveness, and timely guidance to shape outcomes naturally. And she watched Emily approach Michael with a suggestion for arranging the remaining breakfast dishes, noting the careful balance between assertiveness and caution, and Margaret mentally catalogued each element, recognizing the patterns and anticipating responses, ready to adjust her own approach in response to shifts in tone or gesture. And she moved to pour herself a fresh cup of tea, savoring the warmth and aroma, grounding herself in the familiar ritual while continuing her internal analysis. And she observed the way Emily interacted with visiting relatives, the slight hesitations, the measured choices of words, the careful positioning of body and hands, each subtle clue adding to Margaret's understanding of intent and mindset. And she felt a quiet satisfaction in the depth of insight gained from patient observation and awareness, knowing that these details would guide her interactions, enable her to maintain influence, and support her in preserving both dignity and harmony within the household. And as she set her cup down with deliberate care, she noted the arrival of a neighbor, greeting the newcomer with warmth and attentiveness, all the while monitoring responses, gestures, and interactions, appreciating the layers of communication beyond words alone. And she reflected on the careful balance of guidance and discretion, recognizing that her presence, patience, and insight could subtly steer the day's unfolding events, allowing family members to act freely while still maintaining awareness and influence. And she continued through the living areas, arranging decorative items, adjusting lighting, noticing the angles of windows, the reflections in mirrors, the interplay of shadows and light across surfaces, all contributing to her understanding of the environment and the behaviors within it. And she considered the influence of mood, energy, and timing on interactions, noting how small changes in placement, posture, or emphasis could alter perceptions and responses. And she allowed herself a quiet sense of accomplishment for the preparation and mindfulness that enabled her to anticipate and respond effectively to the dynamics in play. And as she listened to conversations unfolding in adjacent rooms, she noted the pauses, the subtle exchanges of glances, the timing of laughter, the cadence of speech, each a clue to intention, motivation, and alignment of thoughts. And she reflected on how these observations allowed her to guide the atmosphere, foster positive engagement, and subtly redirect attention or energy toward balance and understanding. And she felt a deep appreciation for the power of observation, the quiet influence that comes from attentiveness, strategic patience, and gentle guidance. And she continued to move through the house with measured, graceful steps, adjusting minor details, offering polite remarks, acknowledging contributions, maintaining a composed demeanor while internally assessing and preparing. And she knew that her consistent awareness, thoughtful analysis, and careful management of these interactions would ensure that the morning unfolded with harmony, insight, and subtle assertion. And Margaret maintained her calm, attentive presence, fully aware of the small yet meaningful details that defined the day, recognizing the opportunities within each interaction to support, influence, and maintain the integrity of the household, all while preserving an atmosphere of warmth, comfort, and natural flow. And she moved from room to room, fully engaged in both observation and subtle guidance, appreciating the nuanced dance of human behavior, the interplay of intention, perception, and response, and recognizing the quiet satisfaction and strength that came from mastering the art of awareness, patience, and measured influence throughout the morning's unfolding events. Margaret paused by the large bay window, sunlight streaming through the glass, illuminating the subtle patterns on the carpet and casting gentle reflections across the room. And she observed Emily carefully adjusting a stack of plates on the sideboard, her movements deliberate, precise, yet tinged with a nervous energy that Margaret could not help but notice, a small smile playing on her lips as she acknowledged the tiny tells that gave insight into the mind of her daughter-in-law. And she sipped her tea slowly, feeling the warmth seep into her hands, grounding her while her mind continued its intricate analysis of the household dynamics, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the cadence of voice, the slight inflections and gestures that spoke volumes more than words ever could. And Margaret allowed herself a quiet reflection on the years she had spent understanding human behavior, the countless hours of observing, listening, and anticipating. And she understood that patience and awareness were the most powerful tools she could employ, tools that allowed her to navigate complex relationships with grace and foresight. And as she moved to straighten a cushion on the sofa, aligning it with meticulous care, she continued to monitor interactions, noting how Emily engaged with Michael, the careful phrasing of questions, the poised delivery, the subtle attempts to influence opinions and actions, all revealing intentions and ambitions that Margaret had learned to perceive long ago. And she thought about how each small gesture, each carefully timed action, could alter the balance of influence within the household. And she appreciated the art of subtle guidance, of directing the flow of conversation and activity without overt direction or control, allowing the natural progression of events to unfold while gently steering outcomes toward harmony and insight. And she observed Emily's exchanges with other family members, noting the flickers of expression, the brief pauses, the unspoken communications conveyed through posture, eye contact, and movement. And Margaret catalogued these observations internally, building a map of intent, preference, and alignment that would guide her decisions as the day progressed. And she felt a sense of satisfaction in the depth of understanding she had cultivated, the ability to perceive hidden layers of motivation and respond with measured influence. And she reflected on the balance required to maintain authority while nurturing goodwill, the delicate interplay of guidance, observation, and restraint. And as she set down her teacup on the polished side table, she noted the subtle warmth of the morning light, the gentle sway of curtains in the breeze, the comforting order of the home, all reinforcing the calm presence she projected. And Margaret continued her thoughtful movements, arranging decorative items, adjusting small details that contributed to both aesthetics and perception, always mindful of the cues they sent. And she observed how Emily moved about the room with purpose, yet certain patterns suggested underlying tension. And Margaret acknowledged these patterns with quiet attention, knowing that awareness of these dynamics would enable her to maintain composure, influence, and insight throughout the day. and she reflected on the lessons learned over decades: the cultivation of perception, patience, and empathy, the understanding of human nature, and the skill of gently guiding interactions toward balanced, harmonious outcomes. And as she listened to the conversations around her, noting the cadence, inflections, and pauses, she continued to weave her observations into a coherent understanding of the environment, recognizing the subtle interplay of motivation, intent, and response, and appreciating how the combination of calm presence, thoughtful engagement, and strategic awareness could shape the day's unfolding, allowing her to influence, guide, and support with discretion, subtlety, and grace. And Margaret moved seamlessly through the spaces, attending to details both large and small, offering polite remarks and gestures of warmth, all while internally assessing, anticipating, and preparing. And she felt a quiet pride in the mastery of her attentiveness, the capacity to read the nuances of behavior, and the ability to maintain control and insight through careful observation, thoughtful interaction, and patient guidance. And as the morning progressed, she continued to observe, to adjust, to engage, understanding that each moment held potential for insight, influence, and the subtle assertion of presence. And she recognized that the calm, attentive awareness she cultivated would allow her to navigate the complex patterns of interaction, ensuring the household moved smoothly, relationships were respected, and her quiet authority and wisdom remained evident, guiding the flow of the day with a gentle but assured hand. All while preserving the warmth, comfort, and natural ease of the environment. And Margaret continued through the home with focused awareness, attentive observation, and quiet guidance, confident in her ability to perceive, influence, and maintain both harmony and insight throughout every interaction. Margaret remained in the sunlit living room, observing the subtle movements and expressions of her family with a steady and discerning eye, noting how Emily shifted slightly as she placed a set of coasters on the coffee table, a gesture precise yet betraying a hint of anticipation. And Margaret allowed herself a small, knowing smile, recognizing the careful orchestration in every action, the deliberate attempts to influence perception. And she reflected on how over the years she had honed the ability to perceive these silent cues, understanding that the nuances of posture, glance, and inflection often revealed more than spoken words. And she sipped her tea, the warmth grounding her as she continued her thoughtful observation. And she noticed how Michael, her son, engaged in conversation with another family member, the casual questions, the pauses, the light laughter, all interactions layered with subtle undercurrents of motivation and awareness. And Margaret catalogued these interactions internally, mapping the intentions, preferences, and likely reactions of each participant, allowing her to anticipate outcomes while maintaining a composed, welcoming presence. And she moved to straighten the edges of a throw on the sofa, aligning it precisely, an act both of care and of presence, subtly reinforcing her influence over the environment without overt intervention. And she noted the way sunlight illuminated the room, creating soft highlights across the polished surfaces, adding a sense of warmth and calm that contrasted with the intricate mental calculations she was performing. And she reflected on how Emily continued to engage with guests and family members, carefully modulating tone, timing responses, and inserting opinions with subtle assertion. And Margaret recognized the skill in these maneuvers but also noted the slight inconsistencies, the minor hesitations, the brief flickers of uncertainty that betrayed underlying tension or ambition. And she allowed herself a quiet satisfaction, knowing that awareness and patience provided a greater advantage than immediate confrontation. And she moved to adjust a small decorative piece on the mantel, taking a moment to observe the reflections in the glass, the alignment of frames, and the spatial arrangement of objects, understanding that the careful cultivation of order and aesthetic contributed to both perception and control. And she continued to track the interactions, noticing how Emily occasionally glanced toward her, a subtle testing of boundaries and observation. And Margaret met these glances with calm assurance, a composed gaze that conveyed both attentiveness and quiet authority. And she considered how each word, gesture, and glance throughout the morning formed part of an intricate web of communication, unspoken agreements, and intentions. And she catalogued each in her mind, noting possible points of influence, potential adjustments, and the ways subtle guidance could shape interactions naturally, while preserving harmony and mutual respect. And she moved to the dining area to rearrange a small set of napkins, each fold deliberate, each placement precise, reinforcing her composed presence and attention to detail. And she listened to the conversations around her, noting shifts in tone, the cadence of speech, the micro-expressions that suggested underlying motivations, and she understood how these factors could subtly alter the dynamics of the household, and she reflected on how her years of experience allowed her to maintain a balance of observation, strategic influence, and patience, guiding the flow of interaction without overtly directing it, and she felt a quiet satisfaction in the mastery of awareness, the ability to perceive, interpret, and influence with discretion, and she recognized that the small, deliberate actions she took, aligning objects, adjusting seating, offering thoughtful remarks, contributed to a sense of order, presence, and subtle authority, and she continued her observations, watching how Emily engaged in small talk, noting the careful modulation of voice, the measured pacing, the subtle choices in eye contact and gesture, and Margaret catalogued each as part of the broader understanding of relationships, influence, and intentions within the home, and she felt reassured by her capacity to navigate these complexities, to maintain control through quiet attentiveness and thoughtful guidance, and as she moved back to the sitting area, she allowed herself a reflective pause, appreciating the calm atmosphere, the warmth of sunlight on her skin, the soft hum of household activity, while remaining acutely aware of the dynamics and interactions unfolding around her, and she understood that the morning was both ordinary and full of opportunities for insight, influence, and subtle guidance, and she continued to engage in the household routines with composure, attentiveness, and careful consideration, confident that her steady presence, patience, and skillful observation ensured both the smooth unfolding of events and the preservation of harmony, respect, and understanding throughout the day, and she moved with deliberate grace through each space, monitoring, adjusting, and engaging, aware that each gesture, glance, and remark shaped the interactions, all while maintaining the serene and composed exterior that allowed her to exercise influence with subtlety, discretion, and quiet effectiveness. Margaret remained poised in the bright sitting room, the late morning sunlight spilling across the polished wooden floors and casting soft shadows that danced subtly with the movement of the curtains in the gentle breeze, and she observed Emily as she moved around, placing a small stack of coasters on the sideboard and adjusting the positioning of decorative plates with precise care, noting the slight tension in her shoulders, the careful consideration in each step, and Margaret allowed herself a faint, private smile, recognizing the quiet signs of ambition, anticipation, and the desire for approval, and she reflected on the skill required to perceive these subtle indicators, a talent refined over decades of attentiveness and careful observation, and she moved gracefully to straighten a cushion on the sofa, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the armchair, appreciating the way small gestures and attention to detail could project presence, influence, and composure without the need for overt direction, and she sipped her tea, savoring the warmth and aroma, grounding herself as she continued to catalogue the interactions unfolding around her, noting the inflections in Emily's voice as she conversed with family members, the micro-expressions that hinted at thought processes, the deliberate pauses that suggested contemplation or cautious strategy, and Margaret internally mapped each movement and word, constructing a detailed understanding of intent, preference, and possible outcomes, and she reflected on how subtle influence and measured guidance could be applied to maintain harmony while observing and steering dynamics unobtrusively. And she watched as Michael engaged with another cousin, the easy flow of conversation punctuated by brief laughter, careful phrasing, and occasional gestures that communicated both openness and attentiveness, and Margaret recognized the value of careful observation in discerning underlying motivations, subtle ambitions, and the intricate interplay of personal intent within a family setting, and she moved deliberately to adjust a small decorative bowl on the coffee table, aligning it with both aesthetic precision and an underlying awareness of how arrangement and order contributed to perceptions of control, stability, and composure, and she continued to track Emily's actions, noting the brief glances directed toward her, the subtle shifts in posture that revealed testing of boundaries and tentative assertions of influence. And Margaret met these glances with calm confidence, her composed demeanor silently communicating awareness, authority, and patience, and she considered how every word, gesture, and glance could influence the rhythm of interactions, how strategic observation allowed her to guide outcomes naturally without force, and she reflected on the importance of patience, presence, and awareness in navigating complex social dynamics within the household, and she moved smoothly to the dining area to adjust. The placement of utensils and napkins, each adjustment deliberate and precise, a reflection of both care and mindful attention to the environment, while she continued to monitor and interpret the subtle cues of conversation, tone, and expression from Emily and other family members. Cataloging these as part of a larger framework of understanding and influence, and she felt a quiet satisfaction in the mastery of her awareness, recognizing that her ability to perceive, interpret, and guide interactions allowed her to maintain composure, harmony, and subtle authority, and she observed Emily carefully engaging with guests and family members, her voice measured, her gestures intentional, and Margaret noted the small hesitations and micro-expressions that revealed inner deliberation or concealed intentions, and she appreciated the skill required to navigate such interactions effectively, knowing that the combination of calm observation, strategic guidance, and gentle influence was far more effective than direct confrontation, and she moved to adjust the alignment of a framed photograph on the wall. Noting the interplay of light and shadow, the reflections in the glass, the positioning relative to other objects, all contributing to the perception of order, control, and composure, and she continued to observe, noting patterns, anticipating responses, and planning subtle adjustments in conversation, seating, or engagement that would shape the unfolding events with grace and discretion, and she allowed herself to feel a sense of quiet accomplishment in the ability to guide and influence. Through careful observation, patient timing, and gentle intervention, maintaining both the appearance of serene composure and the reality of deliberate insight, and as she listened to the ongoing conversations, noting tone, timing, and gestures, she continued to construct a detailed mental map of intentions, motivations, and potential outcomes, allowing her to steer interactions toward harmony, understanding, and subtle assertion of influence, and she moved with deliberate grace through the household, attending to details both large and small, offering courteous remarks and thoughtful gestures, all while internally assessing, interpreting, and preparing to guide the social dynamics in a measured, attentive, and highly effective manner, and Margaret remained confident in her ability to navigate the intricate patterns of family interactions, applying insight, patience, and subtle guidance to maintain composure, harmony, and influence throughout the day, fully aware that each observation, adjustment, and engagement contributed to the overall flow, ensuring that the household continued smoothly while reinforcing her presence, understanding, and quiet authority. Margaret remained quietly attentive in the dining room, observing the subtle movements of the family members around her, noting the way Emily adjusted the silverware on the table, the careful, deliberate placement that seemed to mask both confidence and a touch of apprehension, and Margaret allowed herself a small, private smile, appreciating the nuances of human behavior that revealed more than words ever could, and she sipped her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her hands and providing a grounding focus as her mind catalogued each interaction, each gesture, each carefully chosen word, constructing a detailed understanding of the underlying motivations and intentions present in the room, and she moved gracefully to straighten a napkin on the edge of the table, aligning it with meticulous care. Reflecting her presence and subtle authority, while maintaining a welcoming, composed demeanor that invited conversation yet silently communicated awareness and attentiveness, and she observed Michael speaking with a cousin, the rhythm of their exchange, the pauses between words, the expressions that flashed briefly across their faces, noting the dynamics of influence and the subtleties of persuasion, and Margaret reflected on the importance of timing, patience, and subtle guidance in navigating these social interactions, understanding that influence was most effective when exercised with discretion and strategic insight, and she continued to monitor Emily as she engaged with other guests. The slight variations in tone and inflection, the measured gestures, the careful attention to posture and eye contact, all providing information that Margaret catalogued for understanding, anticipating, and guiding future interactions, and she moved to adjust a small decorative vase on the sideboard, aligning it precisely with the edge, a simple act that reinforced her presence and attentiveness, and she noted how sunlight reflected off the polished surface, casting gentle highlights across the room and subtly influencing perception of the space, and Margaret reflected on how her awareness of these details combined with her ability to interpret subtle cues, allowed her to maintain a sense of quiet authority, guiding the flow of conversation and activity without overtly directing anyone. And she observed the slight glances exchanged between Emily and other family members, the unspoken communication carried in posture, expression, and timing. And she understood the significance of these subtle signals, incorporating them into her mental map of intentions and likely responses, and she appreciated the power of observation and patience, the skill of using insight and understanding to influence outcomes gracefully. And as she moved to the living room to adjust a small stack of coasters, she noted the way each minor adjustment subtly altered the perception of order and attentiveness, reinforcing her composed presence and quiet influence. While the conversations continued, filled with laughter, questions, and measured commentary, each exchange layered with subtle implications, and Margaret catalogued each element, analyzing, interpreting, and preparing responses to maintain harmony and balance, while also protecting her insights and ensuring that influence was applied with precision. And she felt a quiet satisfaction in her ability to perceive and respond with such awareness, understanding that the subtleties of presence, timing, and strategic interaction could guide outcomes as effectively as overt communication. And she moved to offer a small, courteous remark to a visiting family member, noting the effect on Emily and others, and she considered how such interventions, though slight and unobtrusive, could shape perception, interaction, and engagement throughout the room. And she reflected on the importance of maintaining composure, patience, and attentiveness in achieving harmony, the careful calibration of gestures, words, and expressions, and the silent, continuous exercise of influence that guided the morning's flow without confrontation or disruption. And Margaret continued to move thoughtfully through the spaces, adjusting, observing, and engaging, her awareness capturing the subtle dynamics of intent, ambition, and relational patterns. And she allowed herself the quiet satisfaction of knowing that through presence, observation, and strategic patience, she was able to navigate the intricate interplay of family interactions, maintain calm and composure, and ensure that the day unfolded with both order and subtle, effective influence, all while preserving warmth, hospitality, and a composed, confident presence that reinforced her quiet authority and insight.